The desperation in Nora Faulkner's eyes matched the wildfire on the horizon as she slammed the tax notice onto Sheriff Blackwell's desk, her voice cracking with the weight of imminent loss. $300. I might as well hand over the deed right now. It was 1878 in Abiquiu, New Mexico Territory, and for a woman alone, the sum might as well have been $3,000. Sheriff Blackwell leaned back in his creaking chair, his weathered face impassive. Sorry, Miss Faulkner, new territorial assessments. Got 30 days to settle up or the county takes possession. Nora's fingers trembled as she snatched back the paper. Her father's land, 160 acres of promise along the Chamar River, had been her entire world since she was born 23 years ago. After losing both parents to influenza last winter, the ranch was all she had left. The cattle had brought decent money in the spring, but medical debts and essential repairs had depleted her reserves. There simply wasn't $300 to be found. There must be another way, she insisted, her auburn hair escaping its pins as she shook her head in disbelief. A payment arrangement, perhaps? Tax collector doesn't take promises, Miss Faulkner, only gold or band notes. The sheriff's sympathetic tone did nothing to soften the blow. Though I hear Hiram Wilkes might be interested in purchasing your property. He's been expanding his holdings. The mention of Wilkes sent a chill down Nora's spine. The cattle baron had been circling her father's land like a vulture for years, offering insulting sums and thinly veiled threats. I'd sooner burn the place to the ground than let Wilkes have it. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty road as Nora left the sheriff's office. The small but bustling town of Abiquiu carried on around her traders haggling over goods, children playing in the street, a group of cowboys emerging from the saloon. None of them knew her world was collapsing. Whoa there. A deep voice called out as Nora, blinded by tears, nearly collided with a tall figure. She looked up to find herself face to face with a stranger broad-shouldered and trail-worn with intelligent green eyes that caught her off guard. His clothes were dusty from travel, but there was something dignified in the way he carried himself despite the road-weary appearance. I apologize, she mumbled, attempting to step around him. No harm done, he replied, touching the brim of his hat. Then, noticing her distress, he added with genuine concern, Are you all right, madam? Perfectly fine, Nora lied, quickly wiping away a tear before it could fall. Pride was about all she had left, and she wouldn't surrender it on a public street to a stranger. The man studied her for a moment too long before nodding respectfully. If you say so. Good day to you then. Nora hurried away, unaware that the stranger's eyes followed her progress down the street. She was too consumed with calculating impossible sums and considering unthinkable options to notice much of anything. Back at the Faulkner ranch, Nora tended to the evening chores with mechanical precision. The modest herd of cattle, the vegetable garden, the chickens scratching in the yard, all of it represented years of her family's hard work. The two-story wooden house her father had built with his own hands stood as testament to his vision. How could she possibly lose it all to a piece of paper? She was mucking out the horse stalls when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. Visitors were rare this far from town, especially as daylight waned. Grabbing the pitchfork more for comfort than actual protection, she stepped into the yard. A rider approached at an unhurried pace. As he drew closer, Nora recognized the stranger from town. Up close and on horseback, he cut an even more impressive figure, tall, with broad shoulders and a face that spoke of both hardship and kindness. Miss Faulkner, he called, reining his horse to a stop at a respectful distance. Who's asking? Nora replied warily, not lowering the pitchfork. He dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. My name is Grant Lawson. The barkeep in town mentioned this was the Faulkner place. And what business do you have here, Mr. Lawson? Grant removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a slight wave to it. I couldn't help but notice your distress in town. Sheriff mentioned you're facing some tax troubles. Nora's knuckles whitened around the pitchfork handle. The sheriff had no right to discuss my personal affairs. He didn't need to say much. Small towns have big ears. Grant's expression remained earnest. I understand you need $300 within 30 days. Did you come all the way out here to state the obvious? Anger flared in Nora's chest. Or perhaps to make an offer on my land before it goes to auction? Neither, Grant said calmly. I came to propose a solution. Something in his tone made Nora lower the pitchfork slightly. What sort of solution? A partnership, he replied. Of sorts. Nora's eyes narrowed with suspicion. I'm not interested in selling shares of my ranch. That's not what I'm suggesting. Grant took a deep breath. I'm proposing marriage. The pitchfork clattered to the ground. Have you lost your mind? Hear me out, he said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. I've been looking to settle somewhere, build something. I have savings enough to pay your tax bill with plenty left over. What I don't have is land. Nora stared at him in disbelief. So you want to buy yourself a wife and a ranch in one transaction? I may be desperate, Mr. Lawson, but I'm not for sale. That's not it at all, Grant countered, his voice steady despite her hostility. I'm talking about an equal partnership. The land remains in both our names. You keep running things as you have been. I contribute labor and capital. We share the proceeds. And I'm expected to share my bed as well, Nora challenged. A flush crept up Grant's neck. No, madam, I would never presume such a thing. We would be married in name only for as long as you wish it. I'll sleep in the barn if need be. Nora's mind raced. The proposition was outlandish, scandalous even. Yet as the silence stretched between them, the desperate reality of her situation pressed in. Without this man's money, she would lose everything within a month. Why would you do this? She finally asked. There must be simpler ways to acquire land. Grant shifted his weight, looking momentarily uncomfortable. I have my reasons for wanting to settle in this area, none of them nefarious, I assure you, but I believe in straightforward dealings and this arrangement benefits us both. You don't even know me, Nora pointed out. I could be impossible to live with. A hint of a smile touched Grant's lips. I'm willing to take that chance if you are. The absurdity of the situation suddenly struck Nora and she let out a sharp, humorless laugh. This is madness, perhaps, Grant agreed. But sometimes madness is preferable to defeat. Nora looked past him to the land that had been her family's for generations, the rolling hills, the cottonwoods along the creek, the mountains in the distance. Then she looked back at this stranger offering salvation through the most unexpected means. I'll need time to think, she said finally. Grant nodded, replacing his hat. Of course. I've taken a room at the hotel in town. I'll wait for your answer until the end of the week. As he mounted his horse, he added, Whatever you decide, Miss Faulkner, I wish you well. Nora watched him ride away, the dust from his horse's hooves settling in the golden light of sunset. His proposal hung in the air like the distant rumble of approaching thunder, impossible to ignore and fraught with unpredictable consequences. The next morning found Nora splitting wood with vicious efficiency, each swing of the axe punctuating her troubled thoughts. A marriage of convenience. The very idea was preposterous, yet people married for less romantic reasons all the time. Her own parents had been introduced through a matchmaker, with love growing later from respect and shared purpose. But this was different. Grant Lawson was a complete stranger with unknown motives. His offer might solve her immediate problem, but at what cost to her independence? The land would be in both their names, meaning she would no longer have sole authority over her family legacy. By midday, Nora had worked herself into a state of physical exhaustion that did nothing to quiet her mind. She was washing up at the pump when she spotted a cloud of dust approaching from the direction of town. Assuming it was Grant returning for her answer, she quickly pinned up her hair and straightened her work dress. To her surprise, the approaching riders were Hiram Wilkes and two of his men. The cattle baron's arrival sent a surge of dread through her. At 55, Wilkes had built his empire through means that straddled the line between shrewd and ruthless. He dismounted with the stiffness of age, eyeing the modest ranch with poorly concealed avarice. Miss Faulkner, he greeted, his voice as dry as the desert wind. Beautiful day, isn't it, Mr. Wilkes? Nora acknowledged coolly. What brings you out this way? Wilkes removed his gloves, tapping them against his palm. Just being neighborly, I heard about your tax troubles. Thought I might be able to help. That's very kind, but I don't recall asking for assistance. The older man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Pride is a luxury for those who can afford it, my dear. I'm prepared to offer you $800 for this property. That's nearly twice what it's worth, considering the condition of the place. Nora fought to keep her expression neutral. The land alone was worth 5 times his offer, as Wilkes well knew. Thank you, but I'm not interested in selling. Be reasonable, Wilkes pressed. You can't manage this place alone, and you certainly can't pay that tax bill. $800 would give you a fresh start somewhere else. This is my home, Mr. Wilkes. It's not for sale at any price. The cattle baron's demeanor hardened. The way I hear it, it won't be your home for much longer. When the county takes it, I'll buy it at auction for far less than I'm offering now. Then I suggest you save your money for the auction, Nora replied, struggling to maintain her composure. Wilkes studied her for a long moment before signaling to his men to mount up. I admire your spirit, Miss Faulkner, but stubbornness won't save this ranch. He swung back onto his horse with practiced ease. My offer stands until the end of the week. After that, you're on your own. As they rode away, Nora's hands trembled with anger and fear. Wilkes would never give her a fair price, but his visit had clarified one thing. She needed to make a decision about Grant Lawson's proposal sooner rather than later. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when Nora hitched her wagon and drove into town. She had spent hours deliberating, weighing her limited options against her principles. In the end, practicality won out over pride. She would speak with Grant Lawson and get a better measure of the man before making her final decision. Abiquiu was unusually busy for a weekday. A cattle drive had paused near town, bringing cowboys with money to spend and a thirst to quench. Nora navigated her wagon through the crowded Main Street, aware of the curious glances from townspeople who had likely already heard of her financial troubles. She found Grant exiting the general store, his arms loaded with parcels. When he spotted her, surprise and something that might have been hope flickered across his face. "Miss Faulkner," he greeted, shifting his packages to tip his hat. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon. Do you have time to talk, Mr. Lawson?" Nora asked, suddenly feeling the weight of every eye in town upon them. Understanding her discomfort, Grant nodded toward the wagon. "Allow me to stow these items at the hotel. Perhaps we could take a ride. There's a pleasant spot by the river just outside town." 20 minutes later, they sat on a fallen log overlooking the Chamar River, the sound of flowing water providing both privacy and a soothing backdrop for difficult conversation. Nora studied Grant's profile as he skipped a stone across the water's surface. In the golden afternoon light, she could better assess the man who proposed to become her husband. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with the weathered complexion of someone who lived primarily outdoors. His hands bore calluses that spoke of hard work rather than gunplay, and though he wore a sidearm like most men in the territory, it seemed more practical tool than defining characteristic. There was an air of quiet competence about him that Nora found herself reluctantly admiring. "Mr. Lawson," she began, "before I consider your unusual proposal any further, I need to know more about you. Who you are, where you come from, and most importantly, why you're really offering to marry a woman you've just met." Grant nodded, accepting the directness of her question. "That's fair." He turned to face her fully. "I was born in Pennsylvania, youngest of 3 boys. My father was a blacksmith. When the war broke out, both my brothers joined the Union Army. Only one came home." Nora noted the shadow that passed over his features. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," he replied quietly. "After the war, things were difficult back east. My father died and the business went to my surviving brother. I headed west, worked cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, tried my hand at mining in Colorado, even did a stint as a deputy marshal in Arizona Territory." "Quite the adventurous life," Nora observed. "What brings you to New Mexico?" Grant hesitated before answering. "Truthfully, I'm tired of drifting. I've saved every penny I could over the years, always with the idea of having my own place someday. When I arrived in Abiquiu, something about it felt right. And why marriage? Why not simply buy land outright? Good land with water rights is hard to come by," Grant explained. "Most of what's available either can't support cattle or is controlled by men like Hiram Wilkes who won't sell at a fair price. Nora's eyes narrowed at the mention of Wilkes. "You know Wilkes, only by reputation, and what I observed in town." Grant's expression hardened slightly. "Men like him are common enough across the territories, building empires by squeezing out smaller operations." "He offered to buy my ranch today," Nora admitted, "for far less than it's worth." Grant didn't seem surprised. "That fits with what I've heard." A comfortable silence fell between them as Nora processed this information. There was one more question she needed answered. "In this arrangement you're proposing," she said carefully, "what exactly would be expected of me as your wife?" Grant's gaze remained steady, though a slight flush colored his cheeks. "Only what you freely choose to give, Miss Faulkner. I meant what I said about this being a partnership. We would share the work, the decisions, and the rewards. As for other matters, I would never presume." "And if I were to agree, how would this work in practice?" "We would marry quickly, pay your tax bill, and continue building the ranch together. In public, we would present ourselves as a conventional married couple to avoid gossip. In private, we would define our own terms." Nora stood, needing movement to accompany her racing thoughts. "And what happens if one of us meets someone else, someone we truly wish to marry?" "Then we dissolve our arrangement amicably," Grant answered without hesitation. "I would ensure you retain your land and sufficient funds to continue independently." It was a generous provision, Nora had to admit. Still, the idea of marrying a stranger remained daunting. "I would need guarantees, legal protections." "Of course," Grant agreed. "We can have a lawyer draw up whatever documents would make you comfortable." The sun was beginning to set, painting the river with streaks of gold and crimson. Nora knew she needed to make a decision. The tax deadline loomed, and Wilkes was circling like a predator sensing weakness. "Mr. Lawson," she finally said, turning to face him directly, "if I agree to this arrangement, I need your word that this remains a business partnership unless we both decide otherwise." Grant stood, his expression solemn. "You have my word, Miss Faulkner." Nora took a deep breath. "Then I accept your proposal." The words hung in the air between them, momentous despite the practical nature of their agreement. Grant extended his hand, and Nora hesitated only briefly before taking it. His grip was firm but gentle, the calluses on his palm a testament to years of honest labor. "Partners, then," he said simply. "Partners," Nora echoed, wondering if she had just made the most practical decision of her life or the most foolish. The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Nora and Grant visited Abiquiu's only lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Esther Goldstein, who had overcome considerable prejudice to establish her practice. While uncommon in the territory, their legal agreement stipulated that the ranch would remain jointly owned, with provisions protecting Nora's interests should the marriage dissolve. When they announced their intention to marry, reactions ranged from surprise to skepticism to outright gossip. The speed of their courtship raised eyebrows, but such hasty unions weren't unheard of in the West, where practical considerations often trumped romance. Still, Nora felt the weight of speculative glances as she and Grant made arrangements for a simple ceremony. "People will talk regardless of what we do," Grant reassured her as they left the general store, where the proprietor had been particularly curious about their sudden engagement. "Let them talk. We know the truth of our arrangement." The wedding itself was a modest affair held at the small Methodist church in Abiquiu. Nora wore her mother's dress, altered hastily by the town's seamstress. Grant appeared in a new shirt and his least-worn pants, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. The ceremony was attended by a handful of neighbors who had been friends of Nora's parents, along with the ever-present curious onlookers. As they exchanged vows, Nora was struck by the solemnity with which Grant spoke his promises, as though he intended to honor every word despite the pragmatic nature of their union. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Grant's brief, chaste kiss on her cheek seemed to seal their business arrangement rather than mark the beginning of a love match. The small reception at the town hotel offered simple fare and enough whiskey to ensure the well wishes of most attendees. Nora observed Grant throughout the evening, noting how he handled himself with quiet dignity, deflecting intrusive questions with good humor while maintaining the pretense that theirs was a conventional marriage. When they finally departed for the ranch, now legally their ranch twilight had fallen over the New Mexico landscape. They rode side by side in the wagon, an awkward silence stretching between them. "I've had the bunkhouse prepared for you," Nora said as they approached the property. "It's not much, but it's clean and warm enough." Grant nodded, understanding the boundaries she was establishing. "That will be more than adequate, thank you." The reality of their situation truly hit Nora as they unloaded Grant's possessions: a trunk of clothing, a few books, tools of various trades, and a Winchester rifle. This man was now legally her husband, yet he remained essentially a stranger. Despite her misgivings, she couldn't help but feel a measure of relief knowing the tax bill would be paid and her home secured. That night, alone in her bedroom, Nora listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about her property. Grant had insisted on checking the livestock and securing the barn before retiring to the bunkhouse. The distant sound of his boots on the packed earth, the quiet murmur as he spoke to the horses, all served as reminders of how drastically her life had changed in less than a week. The following morning established the pattern of their new existence. Nora rose early as always to begin breakfast, only to find Grant already in the yard, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs. "Good morning," he greeted with a tip of his hat, as formal as if they'd just been introduced. "Hope you don't mind, I've always been an early riser." "Not at all," Nora replied, momentarily disarmed by his consideration. "Thank you." They worked side by side throughout the day, Grant deferring to her knowledge of the ranch while offering suggestions from his own experience. By sunset, they had fallen into an efficient rhythm, complementing each other's efforts without unnecessary conversation. Over supper, a simple but hearty meal Nora prepared, Grant raised the subject of the tax bill. "I'd like to ride into town tomorrow to pay it." "Would you prefer to come along, or shall I handle it?" Nora considered the question. Part of her wanted to witness the payment herself, to see tangible proof that her immediate crisis was resolved. Another part recoiled at the thought of being seen as a woman who needed a husband to solve her financial problems. "I think I should come," she decided. "It's important that we present ourselves as true partners from the start." Grant nodded approvingly. "I agree. Though you should know, there may be some who assume I'm simply taking over your affairs." "Let them assume what they will," Nora said with more confidence than she felt. "We know the truth of our arrangement." The trip to town the next day proved as challenging as anticipated. The tax collector, a pinched-faced man named Merriweather, made little effort to hide his assumption that Grant was now the decision-maker. "Well, Mr. Lawson, this certainly resolves Mrs. Lawson's predicament," he remarked as he counted the money. "Smart move, securing such prime property through marriage." Before Grant could respond, Nora stepped forward. "The arrangement benefits us both, Mr. Merriweather. My husband brings capital and additional expertise, while I contribute land and established operations. We consider it an equal partnership." Merriweather's eyebrows rose at her assertiveness, but Grant's hand came to rest supportively at the small of her back. "My wife has a keen mind for business," he said with unmistakable respect in his tone. "I'm fortunate to have found such a capable partner." The unified front they presented silenced further commentary, though Nora knew the gossip would continue regardless. As they left the office with receipt in hand, a weight lifted from her shoulders. Whatever challenges lay ahead, at least the immediate threat to her home was eliminated. The weeks that followed established a new normal at the Faulkner-Lawson ranch. True to his word, Grant proved to be a diligent worker and respectful housemate. He slept in the bunkhouse without complaint, joined Nora for meals in the main house, and contributed his savings to necessary improvements around the property. Nora found herself increasingly impressed by Grant's knowledge and skills. He had an intuitive understanding of livestock, repaired equipment with ingenious efficiency, and demonstrated unexpected talents in areas ranging from carpentry to meteorology. When he suggested expanding the cattle operation using some of his remaining funds, his reasoning was sound enough that Nora readily agreed. Their public appearances in town gradually silenced the most skeptical observers. They moved in harmony, consulted each other on purchases, and maintained the appearance of a contented married couple. If anyone noticed that Grant still retired to the bunkhouse each night, they were discreet enough not to mention it. One evening, as summer transitioned to early fall, Nora and Grant sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the distant mesas in shades of amber and rose. The day had been productive. They had successfully negotiated the purchase of 20 additional head of cattle from a rancher moving back east. "I've been thinking," Grant said, breaking their comfortable silence. "The north pasture would support twice the grazing if we improved the irrigation from the creek. With some work, we could divert more water that way." Nora considered this, appreciating how he offered the suggestion rather than presenting it as a decision already made. "That makes sense. The soil's better there too. We need to build a small dam and dig trenches." "I could start on the initial survey tomorrow," Grant offered. "Figure out the best approach before the weather turns." "I'll help," Nora said. "Two sets of eyes are better than one." Grant smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face and crinkled the corners of his green eyes. Nora found herself smiling in return, struck by the easy companionship that had developed between them. For all its unusual beginnings, their partnership was proving remarkably effective. As darkness fell, bringing with it the cooling night air, Nora reluctantly rose to go inside. "Good night, Grant. Thank you for your work today." "Good night, Nora," he replied, his voice warm in the growing darkness. He remained on the porch as she entered the house, his tall figure silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Later, lying in bed and listening to the coyotes calling in the distance, Nora reflected on how her feelings toward Grant had evolved. The initial wariness had given way to respect, then to genuine appreciation. There was something undeniably appealing about his straightforward manner and quiet competence. Had they met under different circumstances, might she have considered him as a suitor rather than a business partner? The thought startled her, and she pushed it aside. Their arrangement was working precisely because romantic entanglement wasn't part of the equation. Introducing such complications would only risk the stability they had achieved. Still, as sleep claimed her, Nora found herself wondering what it might be like to have Grant's strong arms around her, to feel his lips on hers in more than the perfunctory peck they had shared at their wedding. The unbidden thoughts followed her into dreams she would never admit to in the light of day. The irrigation project occupied much of their time over the following weeks. Grant proved to have a natural engineering mind, designing a system of channels and small wooden gates that maximized water flow to the pastures while minimizing waste. Nora worked alongside him, her hands becoming as calloused as his own from digging trenches and positioning stones. One afternoon, as they labored together in the creek bed, the New Mexico sun beating down mercilessly, Grant paused to wipe sweat from his brow. "You know," he said with a hint of amusement, "most women of my acquaintance would consider this men's work." Nora looked up from the trench she was digging, her face streaked with dirt and her hair escaping its pins. "Then most women of your acquaintance haven't had to run a ranch by themselves." "True enough," Grant acknowledged, "though I must say you handle it better than most men I've known." The compliment, delivered without flattery or condescension, warmed Nora more than she cared to admit. "My father believed women were just as capable as men, given the chance. He taught me everything he knew." "He sounds like a wise man," Grant said. "I wish I could have met him." "He would have liked you," Nora replied, the words emerging before she could consider them. "He valued honesty and hard work above all else." Grant's expression softened. "High praise indeed. I hope I continue to deserve it." Something in his tone made Nora look away, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how intimate their conversation had become. She returned to her digging with renewed focus, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. As autumn progressed, bringing cooler temperatures and earlier sunsets, the dynamics of the household shifted subtly. The bunkhouse, adequate in summer, grew increasingly cold at night. After finding Grant huddled in extra blankets one morning, Nora made a decision. "This is ridiculous," she declared over breakfast. "There's no sense in you freezing out there when there's a perfectly good spare bedroom in the house." Grant looked up from his coffee, surprise evident on his face. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose or make you uncomfortable." "What would make me uncomfortable is knowing my partner is catching his death of cold unnecessarily," Nora replied practically. "We're adults. We can share a house without compromising our arrangement." That evening, Grant moved his sparse belongings into the small bedroom that had once belonged to Nora's brother before he moved to California years earlier. The room was simply furnished with a single bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk, but it offered proper insulation against the increasing chill of autumn nights. Having Grant in the house changed things in ways Nora hadn't anticipated. She became more conscious of her appearance, finding herself pinning her hair more carefully and selecting her better dresses more often. The evening meals stretched longer as they lingered over conversation, discussing everything from ranch business to books they had read to their differing experiences of the world. Grant proved to be surprisingly well-read for a man who had spent most of his life working with his hands. He had a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden that he would sometimes read aloud from in the evenings, the philosophical observations taking on new meaning when delivered in his resonant voice by lamplight. For his part, Grant seemed to appreciate Nora's quick mind and direct manner. He sought her opinion not just on domestic matters but on all aspects of their growing operation, genuinely valuing her perspective. When they disagreed, which happened occasionally, the discussions remained respectful, often resulting in compromises that incorporated the best of both their ideas. The first significant snowfall of the season arrived in early November, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse that sparkled in the winter sunshine. Nora woke to find Grant already outside, clearing paths between the house and barn, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Watching him through the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast, Nora was struck by how much his presence had come to mean to her. In less than 4 months, this man had transitioned from stranger to partner to something more difficult to define. The practical arrangement they had agreed upon seemed increasingly inadequate to describe what was developing between them. That evening, with snow continuing to fall outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, they sat closer than usual on the sofa, reviewing the accounting ledgers for the month. Grant's shoulder pressed against hers as they pored over the figures, his clean masculine scent mingling with the wood smoke. "We're doing well," he observed, running a finger down a column of numbers. "Better than I expected for this time of year." "The new cattle were a good investment," Nora agreed, "and the improved irrigation has already made a difference in the hay yields. We make a good team," Grant said, looking up from the ledger to meet her eyes. "Yes," Nora replied softly, "we do." Something shifted in the atmosphere between them, a recognition of unstated feelings, a questioning of established boundaries. Grant's gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest moment before he cleared his throat and returned his attention to the ledgers. The moment passed, but its impact lingered. As they prepared for bed later, exchanging awkward goodnights in the hallway between their rooms, Nora found herself wondering if their carefully constructed partnership was evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. Winter settled over the New Mexico territory with a vengeance, bringing bitter cold and occasional blizzards that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Nora and Grant developed new routines suited to the season, rising before dawn to break ice in the water troughs, spending afternoons repairing equipment in the relative warmth of the barn, and passing long evenings by the fire engaged in conversation or quiet companionship. The forced proximity accelerated the subtle changes in their relationship. Small touches became more frequent: a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing a cup, sitting close enough that their knees occasionally touched. Neither acknowledged these developments aloud, as though speaking of them might disrupt the delicate balance they had achieved. In mid-December, they rode into town for supplies, the first trip they'd managed in nearly 2 weeks due to the weather. Abiquiu was decorated for Christmas, with evergreen boughs and red ribbons adorning the storefronts. The festive atmosphere lifted their spirits after the isolation of recent storms. As they loaded supplies into their wagon, Hiram Wilkes emerged from the bank across the street. His cold gaze settled on them, narrowing with displeasure. "Looks like old Wilkes still hasn't forgiven you for rejecting his offer," Grant murmured, nodding slightly in the cattle baron's direction. "He's not accustomed to being denied," Nora replied, keeping her voice low. "I suspect he thought my situation would force me to accept whatever terms he offered. Instead, you found an alternative solution." Grant's tone held a note of uncertainty. "Do you regret it, our arrangement?" The question caught Nora off guard. They had scrupulously avoided discussing the personal aspects of their marriage since the wedding, focusing instead on the practical benefits of their partnership. "No," she answered honestly. "I don't regret it at all." Relief crossed Grant's features. "I'm glad neither do I." The admission, simple as it was, felt significant. As they drove home through the snow-covered landscape, a comfortable silence enveloped them, punctuated only by the jingling of harness bells and the creak of wagon wheels. That night, Grant surprised Nora by producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. "I saw this in town and thought you might like it," he said. Suddenly appearing almost shy, curious, Nora unwrapped the gift to find a beautifully bound journal with creamy blank pages. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you." "I've noticed you writing sometimes on scraps of paper," Grant explained. "Thought you might appreciate having a proper place to put your thoughts." The fact that he had observed this private habit, one she had cultivated since girlhood but rarely mentioned to anyone, moved Nora deeply. "I don't have anything for you," she admitted, feeling suddenly inadequate. Grant shook his head. "You've given me a home, Nora. That's more than enough." The simplicity and sincerity of his words stirred something profound within her. In that moment, with snowflakes drifting past the windows and firelight casting golden shadows across his features, Nora realized with startling clarity that her feelings for Grant had evolved far beyond their original agreement. Whether she was prepared to acknowledge it or not, she was falling in love with her husband. Christmas arrived with clear skies and bone-chilling temperatures. Despite the cold, Nora woke with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt since childhood. She had secretly prepared a gift for Grant, a hand-knitted scarf made during the quiet afternoons when he worked in the barn. It wasn't much, but she had put her heart into every stitch. She found Grant in the kitchen, where he had prepared a breakfast more elaborate than their usual fare. The table was set with her mother's good dishes, rarely used since her parents' passing. "Merry Christmas," he greeted, a warmth in his voice that matched the coziness of the kitchen. "Merry Christmas," Nora replied, touched by his effort. "You didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," Grant said simply. "It's our first Christmas together, seemed worth celebrating properly." The meal was a leisurely affair, with conversation flowing as easily as the coffee Grant had brewed to perfection. Afterward, Nora presented her gift, watching nervously as Grant unwrapped it. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the tightly knitted wool. Nora nodded. "It's not much, I'm afraid." "It's perfect," Grant insisted, immediately wrapping it around his neck. "No one has made me something by hand since my mother passed." He disappeared briefly into his room, returning with a small wooden box. "This is for you, though I'm afraid it may seem presumptuous." Curious, Nora opened the box to find a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a wildflower, set with a small pearl at its center. It was beautiful and clearly more expensive than she had expected. "Grant, I can't accept this. It must have cost." "Please," he interrupted gently. "It was my mother's. One of the few things I kept when I left Pennsylvania. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for, well, for the right person to give it to." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on Nora. This wasn't a casual gift purchased on a whim, it was a family heirloom, a piece of his past he had chosen to share with her. "I'm honored," she said softly, running her finger over the delicate silver petals. "Truly," Grant stepped closer, taking the brooch from the box. "May I?" When Nora nodded, he carefully pinned it to the collar of her dress, his fingers brushing against her throat in a touch that sent warmth cascading through her. When he finished, His hands lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and his eyes, when they met hers, held a question he didn't voice. In answer, Nora raised herself on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but when Grant's arms came around her, drawing her closer, it deepened into something that expressed all they had left unspoken. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Grant rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day we built the irrigation dam," he confessed. Nora laughed softly. "Even though I was covered in mud, especially then," Grant replied, his smile lighting his eyes. "You were so determined, so capable. I think that's when I knew our arrangement had become something more for me." "When did you plan to tell me?" Nora asked, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I wasn't sure I should," Grant admitted. "Our agreement was clear and I didn't want you to feel obligated in any way." "I don't feel obligated," Nora assured him. "What I feel is unexpected but not unwelcome." Grant's expression grew serious. "Nora, I need you to know this isn't because of our arrangement. If we had met under different circumstances, my feelings would be the same." "As would mine," she replied with equal solemnity. "I didn't plan this, Grant. In fact, I actively fought against it. But somewhere between digging irrigation trenches and reviewing ledger books by firelight, everything changed." The honesty of their exchange, stripped of pretense or calculation, created a new intimacy between them. When Grant kissed her again, it held the promise of a future neither had anticipated when they entered their practical arrangement. That night, for the first time, Grant did not retire to the spare bedroom. Instead, they discovered together the final dimension of a partnership that had evolved from necessity to choice, from arrangement to love. The winter months passed in a cocoon of newfound happiness. The practical aspects of their partnership continued. They still worked side by side during the day, making decisions jointly about the ranch's operations, but now their evenings held additional sweetness. Quiet conversations by the fire often led to tender embraces, and the spare bedroom gradually transitioned into storage space as Grant's belongings migrated to the main bedroom. By early spring, when the first wildflowers began dotting the New Mexico hillsides, Nora realized her dresses were growing tighter around the waist. The discovery filled her with a mixture of joy and apprehension. A child had never been part of their arrangement, yet it seemed the natural progression of the love that had blossomed between them. She chose a sunny afternoon to share the news with Grant. They were inspecting the new calves, products of the expanded herd they had established together. Grant was kneeling beside a particularly small calf, checking its health with gentle hands that belied his strength. "He looks strong, despite his size," he remarked, rubbing the calf's ears affectionately. "Sometimes the smallest ones end up being the most resilient." "I hope that's true," Nora said, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. "For all sorts of reasons." Grant looked up, his expression questioning. When Nora remained silent, a tentative smile spread across his features. "Nora, are you saying what I think you're saying?" She nodded, suddenly unable to find words. Grant rose from his kneeling position and crossed to her in 2 long strides, his hands gently cradling her face. "A baby," he whispered, wonder transforming his features. When Nora nodded again, he let out a joyous laugh that startled the nearby cattle. "A baby," he repeated, as though testing how the word felt in his mouth. "Are you pleased?" Nora asked, still uncertain of his reaction despite his obvious joy. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it," Grant assured her, pulling her into an embrace. "I never thought I'd have this, a wife I adore, a home that truly feels like home, and now a child on the way. It's more than I ever dared hope for." His sincere happiness erased Nora's lingering doubts. As they walked hand in hand back toward the house, making plans and sharing dreams for their growing family, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed. What had begun as a desperate solution to imminent financial disaster had evolved into the deepest happiness she had ever known. The months that followed brought new challenges and joys. Nora's pregnancy progressed without major complications, though the summer heat made her more tired than usual. Grant took on additional responsibilities without complaint, insisting that she rest during the hottest part of the day and bringing her fresh-picked wildflowers that he arranged in her mother's old vases. Word of their expected child spread quickly through Abiquiu and the surrounding area. Most reactions were positive. Neighbors brought handmade baby clothes and offered advice, both solicited and unsolicited. A few skeptics who had predicted the hasty marriage would fail were notably silent in the face of the couple's obvious happiness. One cool September evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a rider approached from the direction of town. Grant stood protectively, positioning himself slightly in front of Nora until the visitor came into clear view. "It's Miguel from the telegraph office," he identified, relaxing somewhat but still alert. Miguel Rodriguez dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "Senor and Senora Lawson, pardon the intrusion. A telegram arrived for Senor Lawson. The operator said it seemed urgent, so I offered to deliver it after my shift." Grant thanked him, tipping him generously before opening the yellow paper. As he read, his expression darkened, a muscle working in his jaw. "What is it?" Nora asked once Miguel had departed, concern rising at her husband's reaction. Grant handed her the telegram wordlessly. It was from a lawyer in Denver. "Hiram Wilkes making inquiries, stop claims fraud in land acquisition, stop advise caution and prepare documentation, stop Richardson." "What does this mean?" Nora asked, her hand instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. "What fraud?" "Our marriage was legal, the land transfer completely legitimate." Grant ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. "Wilkes is grasping at straws, trying to find a way to challenge our claim to the ranch. He's a powerful man with connections. Even baseless accusations can cause trouble. But why now? It's been nearly a year." "Perhaps he thought we wouldn't last this long," Grant suggested, "or maybe he's growing more desperate to expand his holdings." The peaceful evening suddenly felt threatened, the security they had built together imperiled by forces beyond their control. Nora's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, legal battles they couldn't afford, the potential loss of their home, the strain on their marriage. As if sensing her distress, Grant moved to her side, his arm encircling her shoulders. "Don't worry," he said with quiet determination. "We've done nothing wrong. Our partnership is legitimate in every sense. Wilkes won't find anything to use against us." Despite his reassurance, Nora noticed that Grant slept poorly that night, rising before dawn to pace the front porch. Over breakfast, he announced his intention to ride into town to consult with their lawyer. "I want to make sure all our documentation is in order," he explained. "Better to address this proactively than wait for Wilkes to make a formal accusation." Nora nodded, appreciating his practical approach despite her lingering concerns. "I'll come with you. We're partners in this, remember." The journey to town was tense, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the potential threat. Their lawyer, Miss Goldstein, listened carefully to their concerns, reviewing the original marriage contract and land deed with meticulous attention. "Everything appears to be in perfect order," she concluded finally. "Your marriage is legally binding and the property transfer was executed properly. If Mr. Wilkes is suggesting fraud, he'll need substantial evidence which doesn't exist because no fraud occurred." Her confident assessment provided some relief, but as they left her office, Nora spotted Hiram Wilkes himself emerging from the bank across the street. The cattle baron's cold gaze found them immediately, his mouth curving into a smile that held no warmth. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson," he greeted, crossing the dusty street with deliberate steps. "What a pleasant surprise. I understand congratulations are in order." His eyes lingered on Nora's pregnant form with an unpleasant scrutiny that made her skin crawl. "Thank you," Grant replied curtly, his hand finding the small of Nora's back in a protective gesture. Wilkes seemed unperturbed by Grant's obvious hostility. "I must say, yours has been a most convenient marriage." A woman facing financial ruin suddenly finds a husband with just enough money to save her property. Remarkable timing, wouldn't you agree? "I consider it fortunate, not remarkable," Nora countered, refusing to be intimidated. "Though I fail to see how it's any of your concern, Mr. Wilkes." "Oh, I take an interest in all my neighbors' affairs," Wilkes replied smoothly. particularly when there are irregularities that might affect property boundaries and water rights. Grant stepped forward slightly. There are no irregularities, Wilkes. Our affairs are in perfect order, as our lawyer has just confirmed. Lawyers can be persuaded to see things differently, Wilkes said, the threat barely veiled, especially when new evidence comes to light. What evidence? Nora demanded. You're making baseless accusations because you couldn't bully me into selling my land. Wilkes's expression hardened. I suggest you both consider your position carefully. A court battle would be expensive and time-consuming, particularly challenging for a couple expecting their first child. I'm still willing to make a fair offer for your property, which would allow you to avoid any unpleasantness. We're not interested, Grant stated firmly. Now, if you'll excuse us, my wife should be resting, not standing in the street being threatened. As they moved to pass him, Wilkes caught Grant's arm. I know men like you, Lawson, drifters who see an opportunity and take it. I wonder what a thorough investigation of your past might reveal. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered in Grant's eyes. Then, deliberately removing Wilkes's hand from his arm, he replied, Investigate all you want. We have nothing to hide. The ride home was subdued, the encounter with Wilkes casting a shadow over their earlier reassurance. As they approached the ranch, Nora finally voiced the question that had been troubling her since Wilkes's parting comment. Grant, is there something in your past that Wilkes might use against us? Something you haven't told me? Grant's hesitation, brief though it was, sent a chill through Nora's heart. Nothing criminal, he assured her quickly. Nothing that could invalidate our marriage or land claim. But something, Nora pressed, needing the truth. Grant sighed, bringing the wagon to a stop within sight of their home. There are parts of my past I'm not proud of, Nora. Jobs I took out of desperation, people I associated with when I had few options. Nothing that would stand up in court as evidence against us, but stories that could be twisted to paint me in an unflattering light. Why didn't you tell me? Nora asked, hurt competing with concern. At first, it didn't seem relevant to our arrangement, Grant explained. Later, when things changed between us, I was afraid of losing what we had built, afraid you might see me differently. The honesty in his admission softened Nora's response. I fell in love with the man you are now, Grant. The past that shaped you is part of who you are, but it doesn't define our future. Relief washed over Grant's features. You're more than I deserve, he said softly. No, Nora corrected him, taking his hand firmly in hers. I'm exactly what you deserve, just as you are exactly what I deserve. We built this together, and we'll defend it together. As they continued toward home, a new determination replaced their earlier uncertainty. Wilkes might have power and resources, but he underestimated the strength of what Nora and Grant had forged, a partnership founded on necessity, but transformed by love into something far more resilient. The following weeks brought no further direct confrontations with Wilkes, but evidence of his maneuvering surfaced in various ways. A potential buyer for their fall cattle suddenly withdrew his interest without explanation. The bank delayed processing a routine transaction, citing additional verification requirements. Even some longtime neighbors became awkwardly distant, as though uncertain about associating too closely with the Lawson family. He's trying to isolate us, Nora observed one evening as they reviewed their dwindling options for selling their cattle. Make it difficult for us to conduct business, strain our resources until we have no choice but to consider his offer. Grant nodded grimly. It's a common tactic. He has too much influence in Abiquiu for us to fight him on those terms. Then we need to change the terms, Nora said, determination strengthening her voice despite her advanced pregnancy making her increasingly uncomfortable. Find buyers outside Wilkes's sphere of influence. I've been thinking the same thing, Grant agreed. There's a new railroad spur going in at Santa Fe. If we can get our cattle there, we could ship directly to markets in Colorado or even Kansas City, bypassing the local buyers entirely. The plan was sound, but required immediate action before winter weather made a cattle drive impossible. With Nora unable to travel in her condition, Grant would need to make the journey alone, a prospect neither of them relished. It will take at least 2 weeks, Grant calculated, concern evident in his features. "You're due in less than a month. I don't like leaving you." "We don't have a choice," Nora pointed out practically. "If we can't sell the cattle, we won't have operating funds for winter, let alone to fight whatever legal challenge Wilkes might manufacture." "I could hire drovers," Grant suggested, though they both knew the expense would eat significantly into their potential profits. Nora shook her head. "We can't afford it. Besides, who would you trust with our entire herd, knowing Wilkes might attempt to interfere?" The logic was irrefutable, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Grant would make the journey with the cattle, but Nora would stay with Alina Ortiz, a midwife and family friend who lived closer to town. This arrangement provided Nora with support during Grant's absence, while keeping her away from the isolated ranch where help would be distant in case of emergency. The morning of Grant's departure dawned clear and cold, the first hint of frost glittering on the pasture grass. As he made final preparations for the cattle drive, Nora watched from the porch, one hand resting on her belly where their child moved restlessly. "Promise me you'll be careful," Grant said, coming to embrace her one last time. "Don't let Alina's grandchildren tire you out, and send word immediately if anything changes with the baby." "I promise," Nora assured him, fighting back tears she blamed on pregnancy hormones rather than genuine fear. "And you promise to focus on the cattle, not rush back before securing a fair price. We need this to succeed." Grant kissed her with a tenderness that conveyed everything words could not: his love, his worry, his determination to protect what they had built together. "I'll be back before the baby arrives," he vowed. "Nothing could keep me away." Watching him ride off with their herd, Nora tried to ignore the sense of foreboding that settled over her like the morning mist. They had overcome so much together, surely this separation, necessary though it was, would prove just another hurdle successfully navigated. Life at Alina's modest home established its own rhythm. The elderly midwife's experience with pregnancy proved invaluable, her remedies for Nora's discomfort more effective than anything she had tried previously. Alina's grandchildren, who visited regularly, provided distraction from worry about Grant and the cattle drive. A week passed with no word, which was expected given the distance to Santa Fe. Nora kept busy helping with household tasks as much as her condition allowed, and working on the baby clothes she had been preparing for months. On the 10th day, while Nora was assisting Alina with bread making, a knock at the door announced an unexpected visitor. The midwife opened it to find Hiram Wilkes on her doorstep, his expression a carefully composed mask of concern. "Mrs. Lawson," he greeted Nora, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I heard your husband left you alone in your condition, most irresponsible of him." "Mr. Wilkes," Nora acknowledged coolly, "as you can see, I'm hardly alone, and my husband's business could not wait." "Ah yes, the desperate cattle drive to Santa Fe," Wilkes nodded knowingly. "A shame he encountered such difficulties on the trail," Nora's heart stuttered. "What difficulties?" "You haven't heard," Wilkes feigned surprise. "There was some trouble near Espanola, rustlers, I believe. Several head of cattle stolen and some violence reported." Alina stepped forward protectively. "Mr. Wilkes, if you've come to upset a woman near her time, you should leave immediately." "Not at all," Wilkes protested. "I came to offer assistance, given the circumstances. I'm sure Mrs. Lawson must be concerned for her husband's welfare, especially since no word has arrived." "Grant is perfectly capable of handling himself," Nora stated with more confidence than she felt. "Now, if you've delivered your news, we have work to continue." Wilkes replaced his hat, his eyes cold despite his solicitous tone. "Of course. I merely thought you should know what your husband faces while you wait here in comfort. My offer still stands should you reconsider your position on the ranch. These are dangerous times for a woman alone." After he departed, Alina muttered something in Spanish that sounded like a combination of curse and prayer. "That man has the devil in him," she declared. "Coming here to frighten you with tales that may not even be true. But what if they are?" Nora whispered, her hand pressed against her belly where the baby kicked vigorously, as though responding to her distress. "What if Grant is in trouble? Then he will overcome it. Alina assured her firmly. Your husband is not a man easily defeated. Now sit, breathe deeply, and think of the child. Worry helps neither of you. Despite Alina's wisdom, Nora found sleep elusive that night, her mind filled with images of Grant facing rustlers or worse, perhaps injured with no one to help him. By morning, she had made a decision that even she recognized as impulsive and potentially dangerous. I need to return to the ranch, she announced over breakfast, Alina's weathered face creased with concern. Nina, your time is very near. It's not wise to be so far from help. I can't explain it, Nora admitted, but I feel I need to be home. What if Grant returns and I'm not there? What if Wilkes uses my absence to cause more trouble? Despite Alina's protests and her own awareness of the risks, Nora arranged for a neighbor's son to drive her back to the ranch that afternoon. The journey, though not long, was uncomfortable enough to make her question her decision several times. Yet when the familiar outline of the house came into view, a sense of rightness settled over her. I'll be fine, she assured the reluctant young man who helped her inside and brought in enough firewood to last several days. My husband should return soon, and I have everything I need. Alone in the house as darkness fell, Nora fought against creeping doubts, had emotion overwhelmed good sense. Was her desire to be in her own home worth the risk of being isolated when her time came? Yet something beyond logic had drawn her back, a conviction that this was where she needed to be. The first day passed quietly enough. Nora kept to light tasks, resting frequently and preparing for Grant's return by ensuring the house was warm and welcoming. The second day brought a light snowfall that blanketed the landscape in pristine white. On the third morning, Nora woke to the distinctive sound of hoofbeats approaching. Heart pounding with hope that Grant had returned early, she struggled to rise from bed, her unwieldy body protesting the sudden movement. By the time she reached the front door, the riders were dismounting in the yard, 3 men she didn't recognize, none of them Grant. Instinctive caution kept her from opening the door immediately. "Hello, the house," called the apparent leader, a rough-looking man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. "Anyone home? What's your business?" Nora called through the closed door, one hand resting on the shotgun Grant had insisted she keep nearby. "We're looking for Grant Lawson," the man replied. "Got business with him about some cattle." Something in his tone raised Nora's suspicions. "My husband isn't here." "He's expected back soon with a deputy marshal and several ranch hands." The lie came easily, born of self-preservation. Through the window, she observed the men exchanging glances, clearly reassessing the situation. "When do you expect him?" the scarred man pressed. "Today," Nora improvised. "Any time now. I can tell him you called, Mr. Jones," the man supplied, though the hesitation suggested it wasn't his real name. "Tell him Wyatt Jones came by about the herd. We'll catch up with him in town." The men remounted with suspicious haste, their departure leaving Nora shaking with adrenaline and fear. These were not legitimate cattle buyers, of that she was certain. Whether they were rustlers who had encountered Grant on the trail or men hired by Wilkes to intimidate them, their presence confirmed that danger was real, not merely implied by Wilkes's veiled threats. As the day progressed, Nora's anxiety grew. The snow continued falling, gradually obscuring the tracks left by the mysterious visitors. If Grant was indeed on his way home, the worsening weather would slow his progress. And if he had encountered trouble, as Wilkes suggested, Nora refused to complete the thought. Instead, she focused on practical tasks, keeping the fire stoked, preparing a stew that would feed them both upon Grant's return, and ignoring the occasional tightening in her lower back that signaled her time might be approaching sooner than expected. By nightfall, with the snow still falling and no sign of Grant, Nora faced the possibility that she had made a terrible mistake in returning to the isolated ranch. The tightenings had become more frequent, though still manageable. If this was the beginning of labor, she might have hours or even a full day before the baby arrived, but she would need help eventually. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by discomfort and worry. Shortly before dawn, Nora was jolted awake by a pain more intense than any previous contraction. As she struggled to sit up, a rush of warm fluid confirmed what she had feared. The baby was coming, ready or not. Not yet, she pleaded, as if the child could hear and obey. Your father needs to be here. But the progression of labor followed its own timetable, indifferent to her wishes. By the time full daylight illuminated the snow-covered landscape, Nora had been forced to acknowledge the reality of her situation. The contractions were coming steadily now, approximately 15 minutes apart. Without help, she would need to deliver this baby alone. Drawing on everything she had learned from Alina and her own mother, Nora methodically prepared as best she could. She placed clean sheets on the bed, set water to boil on the stove, and gathered the baby clothes she had so lovingly made. Between contractions, she moved about the house, keeping warm and upright as Alina had advised would make the labor progress more easily. As morning gave way to afternoon, the contractions intensified and drew closer together. Nora found herself gripping the bedpost during each wave of pain, breathing through it as she had been taught. Alone in the house that had become her haven, she cycled between determination and despair, hope and fear. "Please come home," she whispered during a brief respite, uncertain whether she was addressing her prayer to Grant or to a higher power. "Please don't let me do this alone." When the contractions were approximately 5 minutes apart, Nora heard what she first feared was a hallucination, the sound of approaching horses. Moving painfully to the window, she peered out to see a small group of riders emerging from the swirling snow. Relief flooded her system until she recognized the leader, the scarred man who had called himself Wyatt Jones. He and his companions had returned, likely believing the ranch was still unprotected. A contraction gripped Nora as she watched them dismount, forcing her to brace against the windowsill until it passed. When she could focus again, she saw that they were approaching the house with purpose, no longer maintaining the pretense of legitimate business. Fighting panic, Nora moved as quickly as her laboring body allowed to retrieve the shotgun. She positioned herself beside the door, shotgun ready, and called out, "I'm armed and I won't hesitate to shoot. Leave now." A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind. Then, "Come now, Mrs. Lawson. We know you're alone. We know your husband ran into trouble on the trail. Make this easy on yourself." Another contraction seized Nora, nearly causing her to drop the shotgun. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as the pain peaked and gradually receded. "My husband will be here any minute," she shouted, hearing the strain in her own voice. "So will the deputy marshal he telegraphed." A laugh from outside told her the bluff hadn't worked. "The pass is snowed in, madam. Nobody's coming from Santa Fe today." "Now open up before we have to force our way in." The sound of boots on the porch steps galvanized Nora into action. Backing away from the door toward the kitchen, she maintained her aim at the entrance. When the door handle rattled, she called out a final warning. "First man through that door gets a chest full of buckshot." The rattling stopped momentarily, replaced by hushed conference among the men outside. Nora used the brief reprieve to brace herself against the kitchen table as another contraction began building. The next sound was not the door being forced, but a commotion from the yard, shouts, the distinctive report of a revolver, more shouts. Nora stood frozen, the shotgun still trained on the door, unable to see what was happening outside. Then a voice she had begun to fear she would never hear again called out, "Nora, it's Grant, are you all right?" Relief nearly buckled her knees. "Grant, yes, but there are men, they won't bother you now," came the reply, followed by the sound of boots stomping snow from them on the porch. The door opened to reveal Grant, snow-covered and weary, a bruise darkening one cheek but wonderfully, blessedly alive. Behind him, Nora glimpsed two other men, not the threatening visitors, but trail-hardened cowboys keeping watch over three bound figures seated in the snow. "Nora," Grant breathed, taking in the shotgun, her obvious condition and the pain contorting her features as another contraction took hold. Understanding dawned instantly. "The baby," Nora nodded, unable to speak as the contraction peaked. Grant crossed the room in 3 strides, supporting her as the shotgun clattered to the floor. "How long?" he demanded, his voice urgent. Since before dawn, Nora managed once the pain subsided. "They're about 4 minutes apart now." Grant turned toward the door. "Peterson." He shouted to one of the cowboys. "Ride for the midwife in town. Tell her Mrs. Lawson's time has come." The urgency in his voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, for the cowboy immediately mounted and rode off, disappearing into the snowy landscape. Returning his full attention to Nora, Grant swept her into his arms with surprising gentleness, carrying her to their bedroom. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here," he murmured against her hair. "The buyers in Santa Fe tried to cheat us, then we were delayed by rustlers and the snow." "You're here now," Nora interrupted, clinging to him between contractions. "That's what matters. But those men outside, Wilkes's hired guns," Grant confirmed grimly. "We caught them following our trail about 5 miles back. They didn't expect us to circle around behind them." A particularly strong contraction cut off further conversation, Nora's fingers digging into Grant's forearms as she breathed through the pain. When it passed, she explained between shallow breaths. "They came yesterday. Claimed to be looking for you. Returned today, I think. They meant to force me out, or worse." Anger flashed in Grant's eyes, quickly replaced by concern as Nora tensed with the onset of another contraction. "They'll face justice," he promised. "But right now, you and the baby are all that matters." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort for Nora. Grant remained by her side, supporting her physically and emotionally with a steadfastness that belied his own exhaustion. The midwife arrived as twilight was falling, bringing her experience and calm assurance to the birthing room. "The baby is in good position," Alina announced after examining Nora. "But this little one is in a hurry to meet the world. We will not have long to wait." True to her prediction, as the evening deepened into night, Nora's labor intensified rapidly. Grant never left her side, wiping her brow with cool cloths, supporting her as she walked the room during early stages, and holding her hands as she began the final, exhausting work of bringing their child into the world. "One more push," Alina encouraged as Nora, drenched in sweat and trembling with effort, gathered her remaining strength. With a cry that seemed to come from the very depths of her being, Nora gave a final push and felt the miraculous release as her child slipped into Alina's waiting hands. A moment of breathless silence was broken by the indignant wail of a newborn testing its lungs for the first time. "A son," Alina announced, wrapping the squalling infant in the blanket Nora had prepared. "Strong and perfect." As the midwife placed the tiny bundle in Nora's arms, the world seemed to narrow to just the three of them: Nora, Grant, and their newborn son. His face screwed up in protest at his abrupt entry into the cold, bright world. "He's beautiful," Grant whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he gently touched the downy head. "Just like his mother." Nora looked up at her husband, seeing in his eyes everything she felt in her own heart: wonder, love, and profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "What shall we call him?" she asked, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the joy of holding their child. Grant considered the tiny face, already showing signs of calming in his mother's embrace. "What about Thomas, after your father?" Tears welled in Nora's eyes at the thoughtful suggestion. "Thomas Grant Lawson," she decided, "a name to be proud of." As dawn broke over the snow-covered New Mexico landscape, Nora drifted into exhausted sleep, secure in the knowledge that Grant was watching over both her and their newborn son. The dangers they had faced both from nature and from human adversaries had been overcome. The family they had created, beginning with a pragmatic arrangement neither had expected to transcend its original purpose, was now complete in a way neither could have imagined when they first agreed to their unlikely partnership. In the days that followed, as Nora recovered her strength and Thomas adjusted to life outside the womb, the full story of Grant's journey emerged. The cattle had indeed been sold in Santa Fe, fetching a better price than expected despite initial attempts to lowball them. The profits, safely deposited in a bank beyond Wilkes's influence, would sustain them through the winter and provide capital for spring improvements. The confrontation with rustlers had been brief but violent, resulting in the bruise Nora had noticed on Grant's face and more substantial injuries to one of the cowboys who had accompanied him. Most significantly, evidence found on the captured rustlers directly linked them to Hiram Wilkes' handwritten instructions that implicated the cattle baron in not only theft, but a plot to intimidate Nora into abandoning the ranch during Grant's absence. The territorial marshal is taking this very seriously, Grant explained as they sat by the fire one evening, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. Wilkes has powerful friends, but ordering men to threaten a pregnant woman crosses a line even his allies won't defend. So it's over. Nora asked, hardly daring to believe that the shadow that had hung over them for months might finally be lifting. Not entirely, Grant admitted. There will be a trial and we'll both need to testify. But the marshal has frozen Wilkes's assets pending investigation, which limits his ability to cause further trouble. Nora considered this, watching the firelight play across her husband's features. When I agreed to marry you, I never imagined we'd face all this together. Grant's smile held a hint of wonder. When I proposed our arrangement, I never imagined I'd find everything I never knew I wanted. No regrets, Nora asked softly. Grant reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in the tender gesture that had become familiar over their months together. Only that I didn't find you sooner. As winter gave way to spring, the changes in the Lawson household extended beyond the growth of young Thomas, who thrived under the devoted attention of both parents. The ranch itself expanded, with the profits from the cattle sale funding new breeding stock and improved irrigation systems that increased the productivity of their land. Word of Wilkes's arrest and the subsequent investigation into his business practices spread throughout the territory, causing a subtle shift in the community's dynamics. Neighbors who had distanced themselves during Wilkes's campaign against the Lawsons gradually returned, often bearing gifts for the baby and apologies for their earlier caution. By Thomas's first birthday, celebrated with a gathering that included Alina and her family, the Cowboys who had accompanied Grant on the fateful cattle drive, and even Miss Goldstein who had traveled from town for the occasion, the ranch had been transformed. New outbuildings stood where once there had been only plans, the cattle herd had nearly doubled, and the house itself had been expanded to include a proper nursery and additional bedrooms. For the future, Grant had explained when presenting Nora with the plans for the expansion. I thought perhaps Thomas might like a brother or sister someday. The suggestion had brought a blush to Nora's cheeks and a warmth to her heart that had nothing to do with the summer heat. As the party wound down and guests departed, Nora and Grant stood on the porch of their home, Thomas drowsy in his mother's arms after the excitement of the day. The sunset painted the landscape in the vibrant oranges and purples that had first captured Nora's heart as a child, the beauty of the land her father had claimed and that she had fought so hard to keep. I received a letter today, Grant said, his arm around her shoulders. From the territorial governor's office. Wilkes has been convicted on multiple counts of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. His properties will be auctioned, and neighboring ranchers who can prove he acquired land through coercion will have first rights to purchase. That's wonderful news, Nora replied, genuine relief in her voice. The specter of Wilkes had diminished over the months of legal proceedings, but the final resolution brought a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. There's more, Grant continued. The governor mentioned that they're establishing a commission to address water rights disputes in the territory. He's asked if I would consider serving as a representative for smaller ranchers. Surprise and pride mingled in Nora's reaction. Grant, that's an honor. Will you accept? He looked out over their land, considering. I think I should. Someone needs to ensure that men like Wilkes don't simply rise to take his place, but it would mean occasional travel to Santa Fe for meetings. We'll manage, Nora assured him. This ranch runs in my blood, remember. Besides, Thomas and I could accompany you sometimes. It would be good for him to see more of the territory as he grows. Grant's smile held both gratitude and admiration. You continue to amaze me, Nora Lawson. When I proposed our partnership, I thought I was offering you a solution to a financial problem. I never imagined you would bring such purpose and joy to my life. And I never imagined that the most desperate decision of my life would lead to its greatest happiness, Nora replied, leaning into his embrace. We've built something remarkable here, Grant, something that will outlast us. As if in agreement, Thomas stirred in her arms, his drowsy eyes opening to take in his parents' faces before closing again in perfect contentment. The New Mexico sky deepened to indigo, stars emerging like distant lanterns to guide travelers home. For Grant and Nora Lawson, home was no longer simply a place to be defended against outside threats or financial ruin. It had become the embodiment of their journey from pragmatic arrangement to deepest love, from desperate compromise to fullest partnership. What had begun as a business proposition had transformed into a legacy of love, resilience, and shared purpose that would endure for generations to come. As they stood together on the porch of the home they had fought for and transformed, their sleeping child between them and their future stretching bright before them, both silently acknowledged the same truth. Sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most perfect endings. And as night settled fully over the land they both cherished, Grant bent to kiss his wife, sealing once again the promise they had made first as a matter of practical necessity, and now as the most natural expression of a love neither had been looking for, but both had been fortunate enough to find.